Well, just when you thought you'd had enough about Russia and the intervention in the United States, the Russian opposition leader who organized massive protests has been arrested. There's huge protests in Pushkin Square in Moscow, and there's a massive crackdown going on inside Russia. What is going on there, and why is this important to pay attention to? Let's find out. Joining us, as he often does, is Elliot Tepper, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Dr. Tepper, great to have you on the program.
Nice to talk to you, Evan.
Let's put into perspective for those people who may not be following this that closely. What is going on in Russia? What's at the heart of these protests?
There's many dimensions to this story. I think what brings it to our attention is the scale, the scope, the dimensions of it, as well as the underlying causes. And we can, have some fun with it and connect some dots and take it all the way back to what's going on in Washington. So there's many dimensions here.
All right, let's start with the organizer, Alexei Navalny, who is the opposition leader, who's 40 years old and he's been arrested. How did he get so many people to protest Putin?
One of the interesting dimensions to this story is, as I suggested, the scope of it, the breadth. It's all across Russia, all the way from west with St. Petersburg and, of course, Moscow, but all the way over to Vladivostok and many centers in between, including the heartland of Putin's support, places that he carries overwhelmingly in elections. The trigger for this was the release of a report by Alexei Navalny, who heads an anti-corruption foundation. He started as a blogger and then parlayed that into a giant movement. People in Russia apparently are fed up, coast to coast, top to bottom, with corruption. And he pointed out that not Mr. Putin, but the Prime Minister, Mr. Medvedev, he's got as much money as, he's apparently sharing in the alleged spoils that Mr. Putin is charged with, yachts, vineyards, palaces. So this was an anti-corruption report leading to a call for rallies against corruption, which was responded to massively, even though each and every one of those mass protests from coast to coast was illegal, that is, non-sanctioned. And if you aren't sanctioned, then it's illegal and the police can move in on you, and that is what is happening.
Yeah, and for people to understand, the size of these protests were huge. The number of these people were huge. Talk about and by the way, the report, when we say it wasn't critical of Putin in general, just Medvedev, he was the president. He's basically a pawn of Putin, right? He's the puppet of Putin, and so you can only imagine if what's said is true about one, it might be true about the other. But again, the Russian authorities deny all this. Can you describe the crackdown?
The crackdown is because these are unsanctioned, and therefore they have to be removed from the streets. It's not anything to do with the content of the report, or certainly nothing about the leadership. It's simply illegal. And in fact, the 15-day, it's interesting, it's a 15-day jail sentence to the leader, Alexei Navalny, was for disobeying police orders, not for anything else.
Yeah, and so Navalny becomes this very, very powerful figure now, and then, of course, in Russia, that means you got to start worrying about his life. But he's in jail now. What is the ongoing? Is this a one-off event, Elliot Tepper, or does this now become a destabilizing force for Vladimir Putin, who's ruled with an iron fist for a long time in Russia, partly because he's created external enemies to unite and unify Russians?
He's wildly popular in terms of the polling that's available. But again, some of that is in areas that are now protesting in the streets. What's happening is this is the 17th anniversary of his coming to power originally. So he and his prime minister basically swap places when the constitutional limits run out, but it's always Putin. Putin's in power as president, prime minister, then back as president, and they just keep exchanging. But it's also just about a year away from the re-election campaign of Mr. Putin. In 2018, he's up for another 6-year term. There's a possibility. The person who's now been arrested, Alexei Navalny, has said, I'm going to run against Putin. And he's just demonstrated right now that he is a very potent force, and he's using social media. This is another dimension. We have another internet rebellion because all the official state media is under control pretty well of Mr. Putin and his friends. So all of this communication that brought all the thousands out to the streets was primarily done through the internet. Very interesting.
Yeah, and just so people know, you might see pictures of protesters carrying rubber duckies or sneakers or having their faces painted green. and the reason is that the report said that Medvedev had been an online shopper ordering, over 70 T-shirts and 20 pairs of sneakers in 3 months, and then someone had actually thrown this green liquid on Navalny's face.
Yes.
Which is an antiseptic, but it stays there for days before. So the protesters were echoing that.
Yes,
so
they were picking up what was supposed to be a negative and making it a positive. The ducky, they were carrying rubber duckies. Apparently, one of the charges made in this anti-corruption report, which was just released, was that he built a house just for his ducks, and therefore that became a meme in the protest.
So does this actually in any way weaken Putin? I mean, people have seen reports week after week. This opponent gunned down, that opponent, this journalist disappeared. I mean, it is a dangerous, bloody place to oppose Vladimir Putin.
Just a few days ago, another opponent, a politician who fled Moscow, member of the party, and he was in Kiev, just got gunned down blatantly, Voronkov, and he, in turn, there's many famous names. Boris Nemtsov. This helps close the circle on what we're talking about. In 2011, there were massive protests across Russia. That was the last time there were massive protests. And that was because of two things. One, there were parliamentary elections which were widely considered fraudulent. And at that point, a co-author of a report on corruption, Boris Nemtsov, was one of the leaders, along with Alexei Navalny, of the protest. And as we know, Boris Nemtsov was gunned down. Anybody who's been to Moscow has been on that bridge or near the Kremlin where he was blatantly gunned down in daylight. So you're quite right. We have in Canada and the U.S. the Magnitsky Law. Boris Magnitsky was a lawyer who was involved with an anti-corruption expose. So it's very dangerous. And in effect, 15 days and so far only about 500 to 1,000 people arrested is not a giant crackdown by by Russian standards.
Yeah. By the way, I'd interviewed Nemtsov before he was shot.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I had he had come here to Canada, and I had an opportunity to interview Nemtsov, and then he was shot a year later. He was massacred in the street. It was just absolutely brutal.
Makes it personal, doesn't it, Evan?
Yeah. Well, these people. They're politicians. They're fighting for freedom, and then they get gunned down. Let's connect one last dot here, because people will also read, and again, we got to be careful connecting some of these dots, but we're going to, when you start Googling Russia, or you start, all of a sudden you're going to say, wait a second, at the same time we're talking about these protests, there's also a very interesting issue with Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, one of the most powerful men inside the White House, is being investigated for his economic ties to Russia.
Yes, this is where we can start connecting dots, but it's all very tenuous, and it's all alleged, and it's all based on preliminary investigation. But the big political bombshell just a week ago was the FBI director saying, we have opened up a case investigating collusion by the Trump team during the election with Mr. Putin, because Putin has an interest in disrupting the American election. And what the FBI director has said, Evan, was this, I paraphrase loosely, Putin was so opposed to Hillary Clinton because he felt she interfered directly in those 2011 protests. That is, those protests are all her fault. People of Russia would love him otherwise, but he was threatened at home because of Hillary Clinton's direct intervention, and in turn, he's now got revenge by going against her and therefore favoring Trump. And by favoring Trump, we know not only through computer hacking, that is theft, but also attacking through the drip through WikiLeaks, that this was somehow revenge from the 2011 events, and therefore the FBI is now checking out collusion between the Trump team, and that includes the son-in-law.
Yeah, Jared Kushner will be questioned by the Senate Intelligence Panel over his ties to Russia and what he said to whom and when. So he will be called to the committee, the Senate committee, and be asked about this. We know now that's going to happen, that the Senate committee will question Jared Kushner over meetings with Russia. So that is a big tie-in. So, there's a lot of threads to connect, and we'll be watching it very, very closely. Elliot Tepper, sir, always a pleasure to have you on the program, helping us connect the dots. Appreciate it.
Certainly, Evan, anytime.
Thank you, sir. And it's great to have him here because I tell you, it is complicated. But, folks, we're trying to give you the big picture here because it all comes back. And these people show up. I remember Nemtsov coming here, the conservative government, like people like Jason Kenney had invited him here because they were no friends of Putin. How the world's changed, eh? How the world's changed.